It's a story for the lawyers among us about a case that was heard in 1995 in the state of New York, which hinged on the definition of a single word. The word is chutzpah. The case involved the senator who today is the lead senator, Chuck Schumer, the lead senator in the House. Not in the House, in the Senate. Help me, Rabbi Sachs. What is Rabbi Schumer? What is Senator Schumer? He's the head of the, he's the head of the Democratic, whatever, the Senate Majority Leader. Thank you. So Senator Schumer, 1995, he had heard about a lawyer who had exploited many, many people and commented the following. He said, "In Brooklyn, we have a word for something like that, chutzpah." The lawyer sued for damages of over $100 million for, among other things, defamation of character. So one of the things the court had to decide was whether it necessarily damages someone's character and reputation to say that they have chutzpah. In other words, is it always wrong to have chutzpah? The judge ultimately decided that although having chutzpah can be a negative trait, it is not necessarily a negative trait, and the lawsuit was dismissed. Alan Dershowitz, in his book Chutzpah, also put forward the notion that chutzpah is neither intrinsically good or intrinsically bad. It can mean, and this is a quote from his book, unmitigated gall, nerve uppityness, arrogance, hypercritical demanding on one hand, but on the other hand, it can also mean boldness, assertiveness, a willingness to demand what is rightfully due. These two kinds of chutzpah, the good and the bad, are each modeled by characters in the Bible. The first is modeled in this week's Parsha. We read that Balak, the king of the Moabites, tried to recruit Bilam to curse the Israelites and sent to him a royal delegation of messengers. But Bilam refused to go until he had heard first from God whether he was allowed to do so. So God appeared to Bilam that night, and what does God say the first time? Lo telech imahem. God's words are clear. You are not to go with them. But Balak is undeterred and sends a second delegation. Now Bilam already asked God. God already said no, but he has the impudence to try again. He attempts to cajole God into giving a different response. And if you read the story, you'll see that actually this second time, Bilam succeeded. And this time, God responds, Kum lech itam, okay, fine, you go with them. But just, I'm telling you one thing, only do what I tell you to do. So many commentators have dealt with the question of how and why God changes his mind. Did Bilam maybe know better than God and succeed in the argument? The Talmud gives I think, the most interesting answer, saying that God was employing an educational method here. God realized that Bilam was stubborn enough that he was going to go with or without God's permission. So God altered the instructions in an attempt to keep him on the leash a little bit, but give the leash some slack, in the language of us dog owners, right? He would allow Bilam to go, but not to go too far. So effectively, God's second response was, well, if you're going to go anyway, whether I give you permission or not, then at least do it in the way that I'm going to tell you to do it. You do only what I tell you to do, say only what I tell you to say. But whatever the reason for God's change of heart, the fact remains that Bilam eventually got his way. And this is where the notion of chutzpah comes in. Even in the face of God's disapproval, couldn't be clearer. Lo telech imahem, you are not to go. Bilam's self-importance, his insolence, got him what he wanted. Sometimes chutzpah can even be stronger than God's will. Actually, the Talmud says, Amar Rav Nachman, chutzpah afilu klape shemaya mehane. Sometimes you can even cajole the heavens with a little bit of chutzpah. All of this applies to the negative kind of chutzpah, the chutzpah of Bilam. But we also ought to consider its opposite. Who is the biblical paragon of righteous, positive chutzpah? There is one character in the text of the Bible that seems to point us towards the answer. Someone who is in many ways can be seen as the reverse, the opposite of Bilam, and that person is our grandfather Abraham. The text gives us little hints to connect the two characters one to the other. For example, today's Parsha, we read that when Bilam was traveling to meet Balak, he saddled his own donkey, perhaps because he was so impatient to begin the task. And to any one of us who is a reader of the Bible, we might remember that Abraham also, on his way to sacrifice Isaac, saddles his own donkey, impatient to fulfill the word of God. Also, it says that Bilam set out with 2 servants, just like Abraham, who also set out with 2 servants. In fact, there is a tradition that says that Bilam and Abraham even came from the same place. The Torah says that Bilam is from Petor, but the Aramaic translation of Petor is Petor Aram. Abraham is from Aram Naharayim. They're both from the same village. The Torah has all of these literary parallels to draw a connection between Bilam and Abraham. And it throws that connection into even starker relief, the differences between them. There is a Mishnah in Pirkei Avot that is dedicated to expounding the difference between Abraham and Bilam. Kol mi sheyesh bo shlosha dvarim halalu, harei ze mitalmidav shel Avraham. If you have these 3 traits, you are of the students of Abraham. What are they? You look well upon others, ayin tova. You have no self-importance, nefesh shfela, humble spirit. Veruach nemucha, and humility. Bechol mi she'ein bo shlosha dvarim halalu, and if you don't have these 3 traits, harei ze mitalmidav shebilam. If you don't have them, you're not one of Abraham's students, you're one of Bilam's students. Why? Because they look badly upon others. Ayin ra'ah. They have a high self-importance, nefesh rechava, and arrogance, ruach gavoha. I would argue that this is just 2 different kinds of chutzpah being explained by the Mishnah. Good chutzpah and bad chutzpah. Remember, just like Bilam had chutzpah not listening to God, Abraham also shows chutzpah to God. Remember the story of God about to destroy the city of Sodom? Abraham challenges God to consider all of the innocent people who live there. Should they be punished along with everybody else? This is when Abraham asks the famous question, Hashofet kol haaretz lo ya'aseh mishpat, you, the judge of all the earth, shall not do justice? If that's not chutzpah towards God, I don't know what is. And like Balaam's chutzpah, Abraham's chutzpah succeeded as well. God agreed to spare any righteous people who might be found. But there was a difference between the two kinds of chutzpah. Balaam's came from greed, vindictiveness, hubris. Abraham's came from mercy, from a sense of justice, a concern for the welfare of other people. Chutzpah can be Abraham's, chutzpah can be Balaam's. Of Balaam's kind of chutzpah, history has no shortage of examples. The classic example in Yiddish culture of Balaam's chutzpah is that of the man who murdered his parents and then threw himself on the mercy of the court on the grounds that he was an orphan. You getting it? But if this is the literary example, there are many such examples in reality. In the international sphere, one of the most egregious current examples of chutzpah is that of the United Nations Human Rights Commission. There is only one item that the Council voted must be discussed at every session, and that is the human rights abuses of one particular country. It is not China, not Iran, not Syria, or any other country, but Israel. Israel is condemned in resolutions and special seatings of the Council, which includes among its distinguished membership Venezuela, Russia, China, and Cuba, among the most repressive countries in the world. Now that is chutzpah. Unfortunately, we could list many other examples of Balaam-like chutzpah, but it's more enlightening and positive to focus on the chutzpah that is more like Abraham's, righteous chutzpah, rather than repugnant. We could start on an individual scale. Anyone who's been faced with a serious illness, or who has cared for a family member with a serious illness, anyone who's been unemployed with rent to pay, anyone who's had to deal with abuse, anyone faced with impossible challenges like these and others, who has felt the pressure of a situation where it seems like the only sensible thing to do is just give up, but who has had the gumption, the assertiveness, and the gall to keep on going, to overcome adversity no matter what. That is a person who understands the chutzpah of Abraham. The Talmud says of the land of Israel, Amar Rabbi Zera said, Bo ure'eh ma chatzifahu eretz Yisrael. Look how much chutzpah the land of Israel has. Shehi osa perot, because it makes the most beautiful fruit. Now, what does this mean? It means that the land of Israel, which has suffered countless invasions and upsets, whose land has been drenched in blood over the centuries, has the chutzpah to continue being productive and beautiful, to accept the impossible challenge of giving beautiful fruit, even through wars and destruction. The land of Israel has Abrahamic chutzpah. Abrahamic chutzpah also plays out in other ways. It is the chutzpah of those who fight for the right and the good, even when the fight seems never-ending. 30,000 children die every day from preventable diseases. Abrahamic chutzpah is the chutzpah of individuals and organizations who strive to reduce that overwhelming number to zero. It is the chutzpah of all those who take up the long and difficult struggle for civil rights, fighting against discrimination based on skin color, religion, gender, sexual orientation, or anything else. I've seen over the past few months the chutzpah of residential school survivors in this country who have insisted, even though others would have preferred to silence them, that Canada confront the horrific treatment of its First Nations. And it is the chutzpah of those who support the state of Israel, even in the face of irrational and senseless international opposition. Anyone who has this kind of chutzpah is following in the footsteps of Abraham our father. It is well known that the Jewish people are called in the Bible Am Keshe Oref, the stiff-necked people. That's called a people of chutzpah. That isn't an insult. The idea is that if used correctly, our stiff-neckedness, it can be a mark of great distinction. And how do we know if we're using our chutzpah correctly, the Abrahamic way and not the way of Bilam? I would suggest that we be guided by the Mishnah in Avot that I quoted earlier. Written several thousand years ago, couldn't be more relevant and important and instructing today. If we have an ayin tovah, if we are looking well on others, the nefesh felah, reducing our sense of self-importance, the ruach nemucha, increasing our humility, if we know that we're acting not out of self-aggrandizement and arrogance, but out of genuine concern for others, despair at injustice, then we can be sure that our chutzpah is pointing us in the right direction. We repudiate and do battle with the chutzpah of the enemies of the Jewish people like Bilam and all of his intellectual heirs. And at the same time, we ensure that we remain among the students of Abraham, expressing our righteous chutzpah with confidence and pride. Shabbat Shalom.